Today is December 1st, 2011. I am David Max, the co-founder of HuskerMax.com, and I am interviewing Jim Irwin, who was the broadcaster for the Green Bay Packers, the Milwaukee Bucks, the Milwaukee Brewers, and the University of Wisconsin for several decades. Jim, can you tell us where you were born and raised?
I was born in Missouri and raised in Missouri. Born in Jefferson City, which is a big city, but I spent most of my time in Lynn Creek, Missouri, which is a little hole-in-the-wall town. They always laughed and joked that the population never changed in Lynn Creek. It was 152 people, and every time some lady got pregnant, a guy left town. So it was always 152 people. So that was my town where I grew up, and then I went to school there in Camden, Missouri, and graduated from high school there.
So where did you go to college?
I went to the University of Missouri. I'm a Mizzou graduate.
And
sorry about that.
Well, that's okay. Did you?
So was my wife, by the way.
Did you get a degree in broadcasting or something else?
I had a degree in speech because I was already, at the time I went to school, after I'd already gone to the Army and everything, I'd been working in radio and television. So I didn't, and those days, in the early 60s, radio and television departments in the universities weren't very advanced. And I could have taught the classes that they were trying to teach at that time. So I took a speech degree, and I've never regretted it since. It was always the right place to do it.
So what was your first broadcasting job?
First one was in Osage Beach, Missouri, at a small daytime radio station. We would tape the basketball games at night and play them back the next day. And it was really good that we could do that because you could critique yourself. You could listen to the playback the next day and say, I didn't like what I did there, or I liked what I did. And, you could actually hear yourself over and over and try to improve that way. It worked out really well.
So, you've done broadcasts for the Packers, the Bucks, the Brewers, and the University of Wisconsin, and some of those at the same time. How did you balance all of those?
You know what? I've told my wife several times, I ought to have been a travel agent because I kept one of those overall airline guides where I could figure out wherever I needed to get to. I never ran into any real problems except the Detroit game, which was recent. I had to do a Bucks game on a Wednesday night and then fly to Detroit the next day for the Packers against Detroit. And that was an early game. And I got to the airport and the flight was canceled. And I how am I going to get there? And I caught a puddle jumper, one of those little planes that went from Milwaukee to Muskegon. Now I'm still over 100 miles away. And I rented a car. It was about 0 temperature at the time. When I arrived at the Superdome in Detroit, was about maybe 30 minutes before my broadcast time, and I had to find Forrest Gregg, who was the coach at the time, and he said, where the hell have you been? And I said, you wouldn't even believe it. And I taped that recording, ran it upstairs to the booth, and we played it probably within 5 minutes after I got it upstairs to the booth. That's as close as I ever came to missing a flight, because I knew my way around flights and how to get from one place to another without any trouble.
So during your whole career, you didn't miss a broadcast because of travel complications?
No, not my travel. The only broadcast I only missed one that I was scheduled to do in all of that time, was when my father died.
Okay.
And his burial was on a Saturday, so I missed a Wisconsin game, but we got back in time on Sunday for me to do the Packer game on a Sunday. So you know what? I did that a lot. It was not a problem. Sometimes I would do a Bucks game, say in Philadelphia on a Friday night, fly to Madison for a Saturday afternoon game, back to Milwaukee for a Bucks game, Madison for a Wisconsin game, back to Milwaukee that Saturday night for a Bucks game, and then out the next day wherever the Packers were going to play. And in those days, we sometimes played 3 basketball games in a row. And if we were playing one again back in Milwaukee, I'd try to get back to do that game that night. So I did that many games, like boom, 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 boom.
So
I always thought there wasn't anybody who could replace me, but I was probably wrong.
So were you getting checks from all 3 different entities?
No, I worked for the same company.
You worked for the same company?
Yeah, I worked for a set salary from this company, and these were my duties.
Okay.
And it worked out really well that way. See, because if you lost a franchise, if the company lost a franchise, you didn't lose any money because you were in a contract that you got paid so much per year. But then we lost one contract, and that didn't affect my salary at all because the contract called for me to be paid a certain amount, and I was.
So you actually got paid the same for doing less.
And you know, that's one thing I learned about sports too. It took me a long time. I used to live or die with teams that I covered. If they lost, it was a downer and everything else. Then I suddenly realized that I was getting paid the same whether they won or lost. So I was just wasting my time by getting into these funks when they lost. But it was always easier to do a winning team than it was a losing team. I had some losing teams.
So let's focus on the Packers. You know, what memories do you have of Vince Lombardi?
Kind of a shy man. He could lash out, but in reality he was kind of a shy man. One of my favorite stories is he and I were going to a dinner one night. I'm coming up one street and he's coming up another, and he gets there first and he waits for me because we got about a block to walk to the hall where we're going to this dinner. And he said, "How are you, Jim?" And I said, "Fine, Coach. How are you?" And he said, "Fine." And we walked the next block and never said another word. Never said another word. But listen to what he would do. In training camp, he had a 5 o'clock club, a cocktail party at 5 o'clock. And you were, as a member of the media, you were invited to come over and share a cocktail and hors d'oeuvres with his coaches and his staff. Didn't talk about football, just were being friends, which was a great thing to do, you know. And if you wanted to stay for dinner at training camp, that was perfectly all right too. That's the kind of person he was. Sometimes when we'd go on the road, he always had a cocktail party in his suite, say at 5 o'clock on Saturday before the Sunday game. And on more than one occasion, maybe 8 or 9 occasions, he would say, we would all gather there to get groups together to go to dinner, you know, someplace. But Coach Lombardi would say, "We're all going to dinner," which meant you're all going with me. Mm-hmm. And we would go wherever. Nobody said, "No, Coach, I can't go." Mm-hmm. But we said, "Oh, sure, Coach. Yeah, I'd be glad to." And so we'd go with him.
So he was pretty much of a social animal with his inner circle then.
Yeah, he was. You know what? Interesting about him was that he was a great coach, because in those days, football was a lot simpler. It's very complicated today. You know, you change 3 or 4 people on every down just about. You get situational downs. In those days, you put 11 guys out there, and they pretty well stayed. You didn't change very much. So if you ran a play, everybody knew what play you were running. I knew what plays 9 times out of 10 that Coach Lombardi was going to run, but they executed so well. His teams executed so well that even if you knew exactly where it was going, you couldn't stop it. And that was what great coaching was. He had those guys really working well.
What do you remember about Bart Starr?
He and I looked alike in those days, believe it or not. You might find that difficult to believe. I have a picture at home that shows me standing by watching him warm up on a snow-laden field one day. And we do look alike. So when we would fly into a city, and we'd get off the plane, some people would say to me, "Bart, sign, will you sign, will you sign?" And I got to a point that I didn't want to turn down anybody else, because I didn't want them to think that Bart wasn't signing, because Bart was the most accommodating person that you ever met in your life. And so I started signing Bart Starr. So somewhere out there in the universe, there are a lot of autographs that say Bart Starr that are really Jim Irwin. But Bart's probably, you've heard of his reputation. You know what his reputation is. He's better than that. He's even better than that great reputation that you know about.
And I actually had the opportunity to talk with him once. He was in Phoenix with a business, and he was actually sharing an office with another guy that had a company called Star Rare Coins. You know, sure. And you know, I would enjoy meeting him someday.
Yeah.
So tell me about some of your broadcast partners. I mean, I know early on in your Green Bay career, I think Lionel Aldridge was.
Well, when I started with the broadcast, I was the analyst. Gary Bender was the play-by-play guy the first 4 years, and I was the analyst. And then when Gary left and went to the network, I took over as the play-by-play guy, and we needed a partner. And Lionel Aldridge, who had just retired, worked at WTMJ in Milwaukee, same place I did. And everybody said, "Let's give him a try." And Lionel and I became partners probably for 4 or 5 years. And then Lionel had depression problems, and we had to go looking for somebody new. And that's when we found Max McGee. They called and asked. We tried out several people on broadcast, which wasn't easy. You know, a new guy every week trying to get him to fit your style and you to fit his style. But we called Max, and he went with me out to Los Angeles, actually here to Anaheim, to do a game of the Rams against the Packers. And it really went well, really went well. So when I got back, the boss was asking me, well, what did you think? And I said, you know, a lot of stuff I didn't understand what he said, but I really liked it. And from that point on, we went together for 20 years. We did 20 years of broadcast after that on the Packer game. So Max was my real second partner. I only had two real partners for any length of time on the broadcast, Lionel and then Max McGee.
So I remember I'm old enough to remember when those guys were playing, and I remember the first Super Bowl and all the stories about Max McGee and Paul Hornung and
let me tell you something
and all of the partying that they did.
Let me tell you something about that. Max was a great athlete, and I find it hard to. Max liked to embellish a lot of stories. You know, he loved that Huck Finn kind of attitude everybody had about him. I always said to him, I said, you were too serious an athlete to have been out all night before the most important game you ever played in your life, even though you weren't starting. I don't believe any of that story. He never denied it. He never said yes, that I was wrong or right. But I never believed that he was out all night. But I've made a lot of hay out of that since that time in speeches that I give. I got up in front when Bart Starr was in the audience, and I told the story. And I said, you heard the story about Max staying out all night. Well, let me tell you what Max told me. And what Max told me was that he knew this was an important game. Paul wanted to go out. He didn't want to go out. He went to the bed about 10 o'clock. And he said he woke up about 6 o'clock and went down to the lobby to get a newspaper. And he said he looked over the door, and coming in the door was Bart Starr staggering in, all out of shape. And he said, Max said to me, well, I hope I don't have to catch any passes from him today. And then I said, and then you saw he had to reach back here, and he reached over here, and he kept going over here. And Bart was on the floor. He was just laughing so hard that he thought that was the world's greatest story.
Well, it seems like great teams like that the players have so much mutual respect for each other that they play better.
And the sad part about that is now that many of those players have died or have some very serious illnesses. Mm-hmm. They're crippled. This is a long time ago. I mean, we're talking about 45, 50 years ago that they were playing. We lost Nitschke. We lost a lot of great players off of that team. We lost Max. We still have Jerry Kramer around. We still have Forrest around, but Forrest is having some physical problems, as always are at this stage. We lost a lot of people out of that.
So let's talk about some former Huskers. Like when you did some broadcasts for the Wisconsin games, you actually did two Nebraska games in 1973 and 1974, and the quarterback on both of those teams was a guy named Dave Humm, who went on to play for the Raiders for a lot of years.
Yeah, I know of him, but I never knew him or anything. Yeah. Just think, though, how my life would have changed, David, if I had taken the job in Lincoln, Nebraska. I had an opportunity to take a job in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1964, and I might have turned out to be the football and the basketball broadcaster, and I probably would have been there for 30 years doing all of those games, because I thought it would be terrific to associate yourself with the university and do the play-by-play of all the sports of that university. And I could have been that guy there went through all those great years with Nebraska and everything. I just didn't happen to be. I happened to be the guy up in Green Bay at the time. But I certainly was an opportunity to go to Nebraska.
So if you would have taken the Nebraska broadcasting job, would you have been partnered up with Lyle Bremser, or do you remember?
I don't even know at this time. And maybe I might have been his guy, his assistant. I did know the Nebraska coach at the time because Sparky Stallcup at Missouri was a friend of mine. When Nebraska would come in, he and Sparky would go out they had a little private club out there, and they'd invite everybody to come out and have a few drinks. And the guy from Nebraska enjoyed himself. Don't tell that guy from Nebraska I said that. But
You're talking about Bob Devaney, I assume.
no. I'm talking about the basketball coach.
Oh, the basketball coach.
Basketball coach.
You know.
When I was at Missouri.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And so it was kind of a lot of fun. But yeah, I know Dennis Claridge.
Okay.
Dennis was a draft choice of the Packers. It was interesting. Dennis and a guy named Bob Long from Wichita University, and a guy named Tom Brown who had played Major League Baseball for Washington. And then he became a football player. And I asked him why he became a football player, and he said because they started throwing him the curveball. And so he became a football player. And Tom was a key member in the first victory down in Dallas. They sent him to the Super Bowl, and Bob Long played a long time before he was injured in a car wreck. He could fly. And we auditioned him, by the way, to be my broadcast partner when Lionel was having his difficulties. And Bob Long knew everything that the wide receiver did. He knew every route, everything. He didn't know anything else about what went on in the football. I said, we need a little wider range than that.
What do you remember about Amon Green?
You know what? Amon Green was a kind of guy who could get you the necessary yards. Anybody who wins in pro football has to be able to close the game out if you're ahead by being able to run the football. And if you had Amon Green, you could do that. And that led to many of the Packer victories, being able to run the football. He was a little bit after my time. My last game was 98. But I was aware of who he was and was seeing a lot of the games and knew who he was. But the Packers always had that ability, once they got the lead late in the ball game, that they could take the ball and generally run out the clock and take care of that. And it always helped a great deal. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the Bucks players. You know, do you remember Kent Benson?
I do. I was there the night Kent got hit by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the very first game of his career.
What's your memory of that?
Well, they were making a big deal out of it. See, Kareem had been traded at his request to the Los Angeles Lakers, and Ken Benson was a big, strong kid from Indiana. And he wasn't as physically tough as he would like, but everybody was making a deal. It was a duel between him and Kareem. And so in the very first game, there was a lot of pushing and shoving down low, and then they went up for a rebound, and suddenly Kareem just turned cold-cocked him, and got kicked out of the ball game and everything. I think that affected Kent's game somewhat, to have had that happen in his first game. He was an interesting guy. He always wanted to go home on the midnight special. If we played a game in Denver, and back in those days, they had a lot of midnight airplanes going places. Mm-hmm. If we played in Denver, he wanted, and we'd be leaving the next day, he'd want to go to the airport and catch the first plane home. He always wanted to get home quick. He didn't want to be out anywhere. But he had a good career. He went from there to Detroit, and had a decent career. And he was as nice a person as you ever met in your life. Maybe that was part of his problem. He was too nice. If he'd have been a little meaner, it might have been better for his career, but it wouldn't be better for his life to be meaner. He was good. He was a good guy.
What about his coach at Indiana, Bob Knight?
Bob Knight and I did Wisconsin basketball for 5 years. So that meant I went down there every year for 5 years. And I didn't have any problems with Knight at that time because I was a broadcaster for the other team. He didn't do a pregame show on our show at all. I didn't like the way he acted at times. Of course, I don't think anybody who was opposing his teams did like it because he was always winning. So that gave you a reason not to like it. But then when I was no longer doing the games, I emceed a couple of banquets. I covered a couple of games. When he was training the Olympic squad, they came in to play an exhibition game. Mike Dunleavy put together some pro players, and Bob Knight brought his, I think Jordan was on that team. I was really bright on that because I said, I think Michael Jordan's a good player, but I don't think he shoots well enough to make it in the big leagues. Yeah, really bright on my part. Anyway, Knight came in, and Knight acted up as far as I was concerned. And afterwards, I asked him what he thought would happen in the Olympics if he acted that way. And that just threw him into a tirade. What did I know about basketball? I don't know at least quite how many games have you ever seen. And some of the guys around me started laughing because I had done the Bucks games all those years, and I'd probably seen a lot more games than Bob Knight had at that stage of his career. But I wasn't about to say that to him.
So, shifting to baseball, tell us a Bob Uecker story.
Tell you a Bob Uecker story. How many would you like? He was for 1 year, my color analyst. We started out doing basketball for UWM, a Milwaukee school, because Robert Eline wanted to get them under the big leagues, and so that's why we did it. And Uecker and I traveled and did the games for UWM. He was my analyst on the basketball games. Interesting story. We went to BYU for a game, and there's no alcohol. There was no alcohol down at Provo. But you could have it in a private club, or you could have, if you had a group, you could have it there, but you just couldn't bring it out of that group. So we're sitting there eating dinner, and Uecker had been on the Tonight Show several times. Sent a message into them, said, send us out a couple of drinks and I'll come in and do 5 minutes for you. And they sent back out a note that said, we never heard of you. I don't think that bruised his ego out, but he is as funny a guy when he gets started on telling stories. And he and I have been friends for a long, long time because we were in the same business. And in fact, I think we were inducted in the Wisconsin Broadcaster Hall of Fame at the same time. So we've been good friends. In fact, I called him. He went through a lot of problems with his heart and a few other things recently. And I have his phone number, and I called him, and we talked about how he was doing. I actually got him in the hospital room. I hadn't planned on doing that, but I talked to him when he was in his hospital room. But he's durable. He's the most dedicated baseball guy you'd ever know. I mean, he's in the Brewers now for at least 40 years. He's like Vince Scully or Chick Hearn or somebody like that, and he still maintains that. I was listening to him this past year when the Brewers made it into the National League Championship Series, and he was just as enthusiastic today as he was that very first. Two guys I really liked a lot in broadcasting. I liked him, and I patterned a lot of the stuff I did after Harry Carey, not the crazy stuff later in his life, but in the early part of his life when he was a really good, solid broadcaster. I met him when I was about 22 or 23 years old. I got pictures at home with he and I shaking hands at that age, Harry Carey. So I always liked those two guys really well.
Yeah, Uecker is, I agree. He's an entertaining individual.
Oh, yeah, he is. He really is. There's no question about that.
Well, let's talk about another Brewer. What do you remember about Robin Yount?
A great player, obviously. You don't get in the Hall of Fame unless you're a great player. Two-time most valuable player, I remember that. They called him the Kid. He came to the Brewers when he was 19 years old, and he was called the Kid. And you know what? He was always the Kid. He loved the game. He played hard every day, played every day. You couldn't get him out of the lineup. He was a solid person, still is today. You see him on a plane or somewhere, and he's still the same old Robin saying hello, how you doing, and all that sort of stuff. So he never changes.
So, in all of your broadcasting career, you've had a lot of broadcast partners. We've talked about Lionel Aldridge and Max McGee. I think a couple more were like Elroy Hirsch and Ron Vanderkellen.
Ron Vanderkellen was the quarterback of Wisconsin when they almost pulled up. They were like down 42-7, and he got them back to 42-35 and just ran out of time and couldn't win the game. But it was a great performance. And then he was also the last guy who went to the All-Star game and beat the Packers in an All-Star game. Vanderkellen had a great game. So I remember that about him, but he and I were broadcast partners probably 10 years together. We would go out, we'd fly into a city, and we'd go to dinner, the two of us. And the first thing he always ordered was a cup of black coffee and some, not Drambuie, but Harvey's Bristol Cream. He had a Harvey's Bristol Cream and a black coffee. That's what he had. That started the weekend. And that was all he ever drank. He never drank anything else, you know, other than one time we went doing a Wisconsin games. John Jardine was the coach. And we started 5-0. And somebody had written we might be the worst 5-0 team ever to play football. But we had begun to convince ourselves that Wisconsin was a really good team. So we went to Michigan to play. And they had their annual party, you know. They always had the media gathered together and talk. And we went over and we had a few drinks and we had dinner and we had a few more drinks. And John Jardine joined us. And between John, myself, and Ron Vanderkellen, we convinced ourselves that we could beat Michigan the next day at Michigan in that big bowl. And we were wrong. We lost, I think it was 61-0, something like that. It was terrible. And not only that, but we lost the remaining 5 games after that. So we finished 5-6. So whoever said we were the worst 5-0 team in the world was absolutely right. And Jardine was fired at the end of that season. And Vandy was doing okay, but I think he got a little tired of the travel. He had had a good pro career, you know. He hadn't been a starter very often, but he had been a backup and been a valuable member of the team and everything. But I think he was tired of traveling. And he worked for General Mills at the time during the off season. Most players worked for somebody during the off season, and he worked for General Mills.
So what about Elroy Hirsch?
Elroy was the athletic director at Wisconsin. In those days, you had to bid for the rights to Wisconsin broadcasts. And now, in most places, you do now. But for a lot of places, in the early days, there would be sometimes 3 and 4 originations of a single game by, say, Wisconsin people. I know there were 3 of us at Wisconsin were doing that one time. And you go down to Iowa, and they sometimes have 6 or 7 guys originating broadcasts of the Iowa game. Then they went to bidding for individual single rights to the games, and Elroy had just kind of become athletic director emeritus. It was his job to glad hand, which was basically his job most of the time. They had other people running the business in it, everything. And Elroy did a terrific job. Gosh, he did a great job. You know, everybody loved Elroy Hirsch, and so. My bosses got the idea that maybe if we made Elroy the color analyst on the games, that would help us get the rights to the game, which it did. It did. We got a 2 or 3 year contract. Can't remember what. The only problem that we would run into, they always wanted to take Elroy out to the tailgate parties, you know, to glad hand people and to represent the university and everything else and have a beer and be the Hill Fellow well met. Well, sometimes when he got back to the booth, he had been the Hill Fellow well met too often. Not bad, you know, but just enough to have a slight slur to it. And but I never. That was okay. It was still Elroy Hirsch, one of the great guys, one of the great players of all time that I was dealing with.
So you were named Wisconsin Sportscaster of the Year, I think, 10 times. You know, well. Yeah. Flipping that back, what would you say was your most embarrassing moment during your sports broadcasting career?
You know what? I think I'm not sure anybody caught it. We did a Wisconsin game late down at San Diego. I think we were playing San Diego State maybe or something like that. So the game didn't start in Wisconsin until 10 o'clock, and we weren't winning, and they weren't either, so there wasn't a whole lot of people listening. But San Diego State scored the winning touchdown in the 4th quarter, and I had the wrong guy scoring it. Nobody ever corrected me, and I never caught the mistake, except we were seated right in the middle of all the San Diego writers and everything, and they all knew I was wrong and everything. And then when I found out afterwards, I felt like, gosh, what an idiot you had to be to call the wrong guy. You know, you got enough people to help you out in a situation like that. I always said the best broadcast I ever did by the way. It was Wisconsin against Purdue. And we're trailing in the ball game, and Purdue has to punt it with about 20 seconds to go. And they have to punt from about midfield, so they're in great shape. Except a guy named Jimmy Melka from West Allis, Wisconsin, blocked the punt. They grabbed it, and Wisconsin ran it into the end zone. And I kept telling everybody that that was probably the best call I ever made in my life. Except nobody heard it because everybody in my booth was yelling like crazy and going absolutely wild over the fact that we had scored a touchdown. Wisconsin.
Yeah.
But it really was always we against them, wasn't it?
Always.
Always, yeah.
So what advice would you give to young people today that want to have a career in sports broadcasting?
First of all, you got to learn how to talk. You need some good speech courses. I think you need to start. The problem with so many people now is they want to start high. They don't want to work their way up. I think you need to start as a small station in a small city and learn the trade, learn how in radio and television commercials come in the back door and go out on the air. You need to know how your business operates. But I run into, in my latter stages of my career, people who had no clue about so many things, and I think I have a friend who lives here in Dana Point. He and I worked together for 25 years down at WTMJ TV, and we both agree that the worst thing that ever happened to us in broadcasting was when we turned the airways over to the listeners, because every listener you had says, "Why don't you trade so and so for such and such?" And you know what? It couldn't happen. It would never happen and everything. But the station let those people keep doing that. And Hank and I have always said, that's my friend, that we got out at the right time because the business was getting away from us. And now you get all of these wild talk shows. You listen to them. And I watch some of the guys on TV. Guys like Skip Bayless, they got an answer for everything that goes on, and they really don't know. They're not insiders like they would have you believe. But that's the way it is these days.
So do you think the broadcasting today, with all of the, apparent monopolies of the ESPNs of the world, that it's not...
It's different. Let's put it that. It's just evolved that way. I'm not saying it's totally wrong, but it's not the way everybody who is beyond his ability to do very much says that's not the way we did it, and that's I suppose we're saying this is not the right way, but it could very well be the right way. Who knows? Could very well be the right way to do it.
So, Jim, I want to thank you very much for sharing memories of your broadcasting career with all of the Husker Max readers and other people, and we wish you the best going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.